on, third graders. No, wait, this is the third grade classroom, but we're not third graders, are we? So I'm Ronnie. For those of you that weren't here last week, I'm the family advocate for the Families Together program. Just want to say thank you again for everybody who's here, for your willingness to go through this journey with us and to dive into this crazy time. Let's start with a quick word of prayer, okay? Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for the opportunity that you give us to serve you and to reach out to people who come from messy places and learn ways to make them feel comfortable, make them feel safe, and bring them into fellowship to help them have connections. We thank you, Lord, for this group of individuals that you've brought together, that you have called, that you've given a desire to serve and to work with our program. We just ask for Larry tonight, that he will speak in a way that honors you and shares the message that you want this group of people to have. We thank you, Lord, again for all that you do for us. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So I want to introduce to you Larry Crippen. He's scared right now. Larry was my supervisor for 6 years. Larry is the supervisor of the Beyond Prison program, so they let him out of prison today to come here to be with you, and it's just really we're lucky. Now I've learned a whole lot from Larry. He's been very insightful in his research on trauma and how to communicate about trauma, and so he's gonna come and share with us today. I'll let him introduce himself a little bit more, other than the prison thing. He might have a few more things to tell you about himself.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. I really don't have much else to say about myself, so we'll just get into this. I'm going to take you through kind of the journey that I went through in identifying trauma in the Bible. Everybody looks at the Bible. When they read the Bible, they go through their own lens, right? Your experiences, your background, you read through that when you read through the Bible. Well, I've been spending the last 2 years or so really researching trauma. And then as I'm reading the Bible, it's like, I'm coming across some stuff here that I'm seeing with new eyes. And so that's what I want to get into. Have you ever been in a situation and you look at behavior and it just doesn't fit? For instance, there's a guy that I knew of in New York, and this guy was very successful, and he was switching jobs, and he all of a sudden made the decision he was not going to apply for any jobs in any high-rise buildings. Now that's kind of odd, and that's going to limit you quite a bit. But you have to know the whole story. You can't understand a person until you know their story. If you get the rest of the story and find out this guy was a survivor of 9/11, he was in the World Trade Center running for his life as the buildings were falling, then you have a little more insight as to why he's a little bit scared of high-rise buildings, right? So this is kind of like, I was reading, hopefully you guys have Bibles with you on your phones and stuff like that, because we're going to be spending a lot of time in 1 Kings. And as I was reading 1 Kings, I came across kind of one of those this doesn't fit moments. And I had to look at this again. And the this doesn't fit moment was 1 Kings 9, 1 through 3a. So take a minute and if you can get there real quick. We're going to be spending our time in 1 Kings, so in this area. So take a minute. 1 Kings 19. It says, Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a message to Elijah to say, May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. And it says, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Now, I thought that was kind of odd. And you're saying that seems like a stupid question, Larry, because he was just threatened with his life and he ran. That seems like a normal response. Stick with me for a little bit. Let's get the background. Let's get the whole story. And you'll see why I paused when I got to this point. Okay, let's back up. We're gonna go through a couple chapters before and look at the life of Elijah real quick. Okay, so we're introduced to Elijah in 1 Kings 17. It says, now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe, I guess that makes sense. If you're from Tishbe, you'd be a Tishbite, in Gilead, said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Now, this is our first introduction to Elijah. The first thing he does is go up to a king and tell him, by the way, God just told me, I'm going to ruin your kingdom. Just let you want to know. And you know, this is a king. You don't mess around with the king. So what do we, he tells the king, I'm going to ruin your kingdom. So what do we learn so far? Well, God's in control of the weather, right? And then the next thing, then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward, hide in the Kerith ravine, east of Jordan. You will drink from the brook. I have ordered the ravens to feed you there. And notice this also. God is one step ahead of the circumstances. He's already ordered the ravens, which is kind of odd. These are scavengers and they're unclean birds. They're the ones that are going to be feeding them. But he's already ordered them. He already has the spot picked out. And he just tells them to go there. So, again, God's taking care of them. God's ahead of the circumstances. And then it said that the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. So, it says, then we just move on. It's interesting in the Bible how it just seems like things kind of go quickly. But the next thing is, sometime later, the brook dried up. Now, how long does it take for a brook to dry up? Maybe a year? We'll just, for sake of argument, let's say he was there for a year. Sitting in the wilderness, kicking back, having the birds feed him, on sabbatical. And he said, because there's been no rain, brook dried up because there's been no rain in the land. Verse 8, and the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zephorath, butchering that, whatever, of Sidon, and stay there. And again, look at this, already one step ahead. I've already commanded the widow in that place to supply you with food. So yeah, I got the spot picked out for you. I got this person already contacted. Your reservation is made. Thank you for staying with us. So, we went to Zephaniah. He came to the town gate. The widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I can have a drink? As she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. Now, you got to understand, this guy's been in the wilderness, getting fed regularly. He gets 2 squares a day from the ravens. Now he's back in reality. There's been a famine in the land for a year, probably, and things are not real good. So now he's gone from, getting fed regularly to looking around and seeing everyone is in famine, right? Including this lady, because it says in verse 12, as surely as the Lord, and understand this probably is not a Jew, because the Lord, your God, lives, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Okay, she was in a bad way, right? And this is a lady that's not even a follower, right? And for some reason, God puts them together. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid, go home, do as you have said, but first make a small cake of bread for me. And what you have, and bring it to me, and then make some for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, the jug of oil will not run dry until the day of the Lord gives rain on the land. So she went away, she did what Elijah told her. So there was food every day for Elijah, woman and her family, where the jar of flour was not used up, the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Now, if you're kind of keeping track here, keeping a tally, this is like miracle number 3, because we had the drought that he announced. We had the ravens that are feeding him. Right now, we've got the jug and the jar that are continually giving food. So he is 3 for 3 on these. So if you go down to verse 17, it says, sometime later, doesn't say how long, but it seems like sometime later was a year, so who knows how long this was, but a long time. So you got to understand, this has been going on for a long time. The jug and the jar continually refurbishing for a long time. The son and woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What did you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Isn't it interesting, when trauma happens, where do people usually go? God must be mad at me. I must have done something, right? They go automatically to there. And this is kind of a common thing for people to do. So she's kind of going, this must be because of my sin. Elijah, if you guys remember this, give me your son. He took him in his arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, laid him on a bed. Then he cried out up to the Lord, "O Lord my God, you have brought tragedy. You have brought tragedy upon this widow, and I am staying with by causing her son to die." Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's cry. The boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child, carried him down from his room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, now this is the interesting part. Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know you're a man of God." Having a jug and a jar that wouldn't stop, producing food for a year or so, that wasn't enough. Now I know you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Isn't it interesting how God uses trauma? This woman was probably a follower of Baal, because this is kind of the area that Elijah settled in, was not a Israeli area. The Baal followers believed that Baal was in charge of life and death. So even though this lady had this vending machine of jar and jug going, that wasn't enough. It took this trauma for her to go, "I know who the real God is now." So isn't it interesting how God uses trauma? This is what saved this lady. So, interesting, that's kind of a side note. Let me go now, we're going to switch gears to chapter 18. After a long time, in the 3rd year, so again, 3 years of drought, how's this place look? Is there like trauma all around? I mean, you can't walk down the street without seeing trauma in front of you. These people are starving. So he's surrounded by trauma. So 3 years, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." So he went and presented himself to Ahab. Okay, this is the same Ahab that wants to kill him, right? And if you look down, he goes and he gets together with Obadiah, and Obadiah in verse 12 says, "I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave you. If I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he will kill me." Okay, Ahab, not a nice man. We can kind of determine that. This guy was scared to death of Ahab. And he reiterates it again in verse 14. "I tell you, if I go to my master and say, 'Elijah is here,' he will kill." And if you don't show up, he said, "He will kill me." Now, here's my question from 19, looking back on that. Why didn't Elijah run here? he's going to go to, this guy's been searching all over the place. If you look up at verse 10, as surely as the Lord lives, there is not a nation or a kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. This guy has been scouring the nations, looking for Elijah to kill him. And now he's saying, I'm going to go present myself to this guy. It doesn't say he's afraid. He didn't run. See where I'm going now with chapter 19? Why I thought chapter 19, it gets better. And so now it goes on. He sets up this contest. And well, first of all, when he goes and meets the king, verse 18, the king says to him, verse 16. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, is that you troubler of Israel? And, okay, this is the guy that wants to kill him. What does he say? He pushes back. He's confident. I have not made any trouble for Israel. But it's you and your father's family had. You abandoned the Lord's commands. He's calling him out. He's standing before a king that wants to kill him, and he's calling him out. Right? Then he says, summon the people from all over Israel to meet me in Mount Carmel, and bring 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. Now, those of you who are good at math will know that's 850 prophets. And so he's doing a challenge where it's 850 against 1. Okay? The guy's got guts. So he's not afraid. Again, it doesn't say he's afraid. 851. The challenge is, in verse 21, how long do you be between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. Let's find out who's the real God here. So that's the challenge. And you guys are familiar with the story. Baal sets up their altars and cuts up a bull, puts it on the altar. They spend all morning dancing, crying out, all this kind of stuff. And what does Elijah do? Verse 27, at noon, after they've been doing this all morning, Elijah began to taunt them. Okay, 850 to 1. He's taunting them, right? Surely he's a god. Perhaps he's in deep thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and needs to be awakened. Okay, he's taunting these guys, right? This guy has confidence. He's not afraid. Okay? And then he says down in verse 36, he prays, O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and have done all that you have commanded. Answer, O Lord, because he set up his altar now and doused it with water, so that these people will know, and this is the reason that he's doing it. These people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Talk about a loving God. He's doing all this to turn their hearts back to him. He is pursuing the nation of Israel. That is our God. He is a pursuer. He comes after us. So, again, you guys know the story. Then the fire of the Lord fell up and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil. Now, to burn up stones, the temperature has to be between 1100 and 2400 degrees. So this was not a small fire. This was quite the demonstration of power, right? So, when the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. This is game over, right? Elijah just won this one. Then Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away. They seized them. Elijah brought them down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered them there. And Elijah said to Ahab, go eat and drink, for there's a sound of a heavy rain. So Ahab went off, ate and drank. Elijah climbed the top of Mount Carmel, bent down to the ground, put his face between his knees. Go and look towards the sea, he told the servant. He went up and looked. There's nothing there. 7 times Elijah said, go back. The 7th time the servant reported, a cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. Elijah said, go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you. Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, and the wind rose, and heavy rain came on, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. Now, this is the next one that kind of throws me. The power of the Lord came upon Elijah, and tucking in his his cloak in his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. Anybody ever been on a chariot? I had a nephew that was in a kind of an acrobat show, and they had like a chariot and horses and stuff. And I went and saw him, and then afterwards I stuck around, and one of the guys, before they put the chariot away, they gave me a ride. Okay, I could never outrun it. Okay, this thing was pretty cool. And the distance, they say, it depends on where you read. Different commentators will have different distances. The shortest was 6 miles, and the longest was like 25. So somewhere between 6 and 25 miles, this guy outran a chariot. Now, this is like a supernatural sprint, right? It doesn't say he trained for it. I don't know, maybe he was with the Ravens, he was training, I don't know. But he went and ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. Now we get back to 19. This is...
Sorry.
You can chime in. So now we're back to 19. And Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, how he killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a message to Elijah saying, may the gods deal with me ever so severely if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Does it now seem a little bit odd to you that Elijah, all of a sudden, it wasn't even face to face. This was a messenger sent secondhand telling him, I'm going to kill you. Well, he's been threatened with his life for 3 years. He's been in hiding for 3 years. All of a sudden now he's afraid and he runs for his life. What changed that now he's afraid, now he's running when he wouldn't before? So this was my what in the world moment. I have a theory on this, and I think the answer lies back in 1 Kings 18:40. Back up a little bit and let's read this again. Then Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. Now, we kind of look over this verse and we say, oh, good for him. He took care of that, got the cancer out of Israel. And we don't think about that. But think about watching this happen. A frenzied mob took 850 men, dragged them down to this valley, took out swords, and Elijah watched 850 men get slaughtered. He heard their cries. He saw the blood. He doesn't have a seared conscience. I mean, when people go to war, they're trained to hate the enemy. There's no love lost when they shoot the enemy. But they still come back with post-traumatic stress disorder by watching that. This had to be an absolutely horrific sight. This had to be traumatic to watch this, right? So what is trauma? Any negative life event that occurs in a position of relative helplessness. Now, Elijah was the one that was in relative helplessness, but secondary trauma, which you guys are going to be dealing with kids who have been traumatized. Secondary trauma is going to be very real to you guys. Okay? You're going to hear stories you didn't want to hear. You're going to see a side of society that you didn't want to see. But this is what it means to go and preach the gospel, is you got to go sometimes to places you don't want to go to. So Elijah had the secondary trauma of watching all 850 men who were helpless get slaughtered. And the result of a stressful situation or event or series of events that leaves to a person unable to cope emotionally. I can't help but think he had to be thinking to himself, because he's the one that ordered it. I wonder how many fatherless children there are now. I wonder how many widows are a result of that. I'm sure he had to think about stuff like that. So this had to be quite a burden on him. Post-traumatic stress disorder is an anxiety disorder as a result of a severe mental or emotional distress, like he saw. The main difference between post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma is important to note. The traumatic event is time-based. That just happened within a few hours. while post-traumatic stress disorder is a longer-term condition where one continues to have flashbacks and reoccurring and re-experiencing the traumatic event. Okay? For instance, we turn to Job chapter 7. And I didn't even realize this was in here. When I came across it, I was like, oh. Job chapter 7. Now, you all know what happened to Job. He had extreme trauma. And it says in verse 13, when I think my bed will comfort me and my couch will ease my complaint, even then you frighten me with dreams and terrify me with visions. He had night terrors. That's part of post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't know if anybody gone through post-traumatic stress and had those night terrors? Yeah, I've had those. They're not fun. You hear exactly the same sounds again. It's like when it says re-experiencing it. When it happened to me, I re-experienced it. I'm hearing the same sounds over again. I remember that distinctly. So I'm sure Job had that same thing. He was having night terrors. So this stuff's all over the Bible. There's trauma all over the Bible. Now, why did this affect Elijah? I think he was triggered. It says here, not only do people tend to remember emotionally arousing and traumatic events better than emotionally neutral events, but they also tend to remember the context in which the arousing events occur. These contextual stimuli can then become fear-conditioned cues that are capable of triggering fear by themselves because of the previous association with danger. Now, what might have been Elijah's trigger? Well, think about it. How is it phrased in 19, verse 2? It said here, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them. One of them who he had just seen slaughtered. And had all these pictures in his mind of that horrific event. Do you think maybe that was a trigger? I'd say so. As hard as the initial trauma is, it's the aftermath that destroys people. Mm-hmm. It's living with it that destroys people. One of the things that happens is in that aftermath is that a person can be stuck in the, I'd say, hypervigilant or hypovigilant position. The lines here, the parasympathetic system in your body, that's where you are 80% of the time, right? Your heart rate, your blood pressure, everything is pretty calm most of the time. And then there'll be a high demand time that comes, right? And then maybe you'll be out of the boundaries, and you're really working hard during that high demand time. And then you come back in between the lines there, and you relax again, and you recover. It's important to have that recovery time. Well, many times when it comes to people who have been traumatized, they get hypervigilant, and they get stuck in the on position. And they're always on the lookout. I used to be a therapist, and when I remember having one guy that just came back from Iraq in my office. And when he came in, he sat by the door, looking at the window, and he told me everybody who was in the waiting room and what their level of danger was. He was still at war. That's that hypervigilance. So the other side of it is sometimes you can be stuck in the off position. You can be so depressed, no energy. I mean, Jeremiah was the weeping prophet. You know, he might have been stuck in the off position. All that he went through, I don't know. But so this is kind of what when it comes to the kids you're going to be dealing with, there are going to be a lot of kids that are going to be stuck in the on position. And it's going to be interesting because you're going to see reactions that you're going to kind of go, this doesn't make sense. The thing you're going to have to look at is behavior does not happen in a vacuum. You have to look for patterns of behavior and why kids are reacting at certain times. There'll be something there, and you have to look for cues. But I can guarantee you, because kids can get triggered by a look, a smell, a season. And there was one kid that was in our group home way back when. This was a very nice kid, good kid, except in February. In February, he would destroy the place. He didn't know why. Something happened to him when he was little. And that, anyway, I'm gonna keep moving here. If there's a continuum, now think about it this way: when you are calm and you're able to process information, your IQ is usually on average between 120 and 100. Our CEO is like 140, 150, but you know,
too kind.
but for most people, 120 to 100. Now, if you're on alert, you think, something might be going on here. Oops. Your IQ drops a little bit. And all of a sudden, it's 110 to 90. Now, if you're alarmed about something, IQ drops a little more. Now it's 100 to 80. Now, where Elijah was, they say fear, he might have been terror. Somewhere between fear and terror, his IQ is now down to 90 to 70. And if you're absolutely terrorized, 80 to 60. Does anybody know at what level you are considered mentally disabled, at what IQ level? You are considered mentally disabled at 70. They used to call that mentally retarded. Now it's mentally disabled. But at that level, you are considered mentally disabled. IQ of 70. Look at this. Do you wonder why terrorism is such a big weapon in war? People have trouble processing when they are terrorized.
So I would say, from a bullying perspective, so you look at kids who experience bullying, it significantly decreases their learning. Mm-hmm. So when kids are bullied and you see grades going down or they no longer want to participate in sports, that's part of that dynamic that's happening. It's decreasing their ability to retain information because all of their other senses are trying to keep them alive or to survive whatever they're afraid of. So it would be another example.
Yeah, they go into survival mode.
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what do you do if you can't process information? You return to what you know. So what did Elijah do the last time his life was threatened? What did God tell him to do? Told him to go down by the brook. In other words, get out of town. Run. So what does Elijah do this time? Same thing. He ran. That's why he ran. He wasn't processing information. He was just reacting. And that's what these kids are going to do. That's what people do when they're terrorized. They just react. They go back to what they knew. It's basically, you kind of go on autopilot. That's why when addicts are very stressed out, they're doing their best, and a stressful time comes, they're going to return to what they know. And that makes it very hard. So 19:4, what was Elijah's request? It says, he came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. He said, I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. This is the stuff that kept Elijah off the motivational speaking tour. Right? Here's the thing that's interesting, though. Nowhere in the scriptures does God condemn him for his honest emotions. He's allowed. He's allowed to have his emotions. Right? He's saying, God, kill me. And what does God do? He said, don't say that, Elijah. What's wrong with you? Just have faith. Faith like a mustard seed. Step up. No, he doesn't do that. Well, let me back up first. Pain. Pain threatens our identity. In Ruth 20, or 1, 20 through 20. Which one? How do you write that? Now, you know the story of Naomi. She goes off to another land with her husband and sons and comes back with a daughter-in-law. Lots of grief and loss. And what does she say? Hey, Naomi, welcome back. No, don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Her trauma has given her a new identity. You ever notice that when people are really going through, especially long-term trauma, then it's like they're known as the cancer patient, the people with cancer, the divorcee, the widow. This is now their identity that they're known by people, right? And it's interesting, there's a book called This Too Shall Last, very good book, This Too Shall Last. And the lady in there is going through chronic pain. She's had it for a couple decades. And she writes, if suffering lingers when pain and disorders and grief stretch into years instead of lasting for days or months, we fear we will lose our very selves. And so Elijah's been going through 3 years of famine. He had a front row seat of that. It's been going on and on. Sometimes you can kind of lose yourself in all this. So let's get back to what God does now. It says, then he lay down under a tree and fell asleep. He was exhausted. It doesn't say how long he slept. I'm guessing he slept for a very long time. I remember having a foster daughter come and stay with us. When she first got there, she crashed on the couch for 16 hours. Right? Just absolutely exhausted. I'm going to guess with what Elijah went through, it was more than 8 hours that he was out. He was probably out for quite a while. And so, all at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was a cake of bread. I'm thinking angel food cake. And over hot coals, and a jar of water. And he ate and drank, and then he lay down again. And then the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up, ate, and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. So first of all, God took care of his physical needs. When these kids come in, if they're exhausted, they're not going to process. You need to get them like that continuum we've had here. You got to get them back down to calm so that they can process information. So they need to know, hey, everything's okay. Everything's okay. We're going to get through this. So, I thought it was kind of odd. I mean, doesn't this seem kind of odd to you? That this guy's exhausted, gives him a couple meals, and then says, yeah, you're going to go on a 40-day hike. Doesn't that seem kind of odd too? Why in the world would God send somebody who's already exhausted on a 40-day hike? I thought that was odd until I did a little bit more research. Dr. Bruce Perry says healing takes place when there are dozens of therapeutic moments available each day for the person to control, revisiting, and reworking their traumatic experience. Now, the trauma took place in the wilderness. He's now spending 40 days walking in the wilderness. Do you think maybe there might have been some things that might trigger him as he goes? Mm-hmm. So he has to process it, but in a nicer environment? You know, in World War I, they had less post-traumatic stress than they did in Vietnam or any other war. There was less post-traumatic, not because the war was any nicer, but because when those guys came back from World War I, they got on a ship. The ship took 2 months to get back. During that time, these guys were quarantined together in a support group. And they spent 2 months with guys who really understood what they went through, talking about what happened. So after 2 months of a support group, they came back doing much better. So Elijah has this opportunity to at least process information. You know, when you have a traumatic event, when you have a traumatic memory and you bring it up, it's a little bit flexible, that memory is. And you are able to rework it during that window while you're remembering it. And you can remember it differently during that time. You can, for instance, if something happened to you when you're a child and you suppress it, you're an adult, you finally bring it up, it's very painful, you bring it up, but as you're remembering it, now you're remembering it as an adult. And you can realize, you know what? I was a kid. I could not have stopped this. I was helpless, instead of feeling like I should have stopped it, or whatever wrong thinking was there. So I think that's part of what was happening here. The other thing that was interesting about this 40-day walk was Jane McConaughey, in her book Trauma in the Pews, said that all forms of meditation that involve stillness and reflection can be problematic for those impacted by trauma. Yeah. Now, the difficulty with silence does not negate the value. It does require healing and or less traditional paths, such as silence when walking in nature, maybe for 40 days. Silent walking was essential to my own healing. The newly found quietness in my mind was profound, and nature was at its most beautiful. Walking made the experience of communing with God accessible. In addition, walking aids the healing of trauma because it involves bilateral stimulation, which helps integrate information into the two hemispheres of the brain. So the emotional center of the brain is the limbic system in the center of your brain. The cognitive functioning is the frontal lobe. Sometimes those two fight with each other. My wife was in a horrible car accident back in 2005. And when she was finally out of the hospital, out of the wheelchair, and was able to finally travel in a car, all of a sudden we'd be driving around and she would have panic attacks when we pull up to intersections. And she would even look at me and say, I know I'm safe, I know this is irrational, but my body is reacting. So her limbic system is saying, danger, right? Her frontal lobe is saying, no, there's not. And there's two different sets of rules going on in her head. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but you kind of fight yourself in that, and you have to work that through. It's a process. So what seemed kind of odd, 40-day walk in the wilderness, you look at it now and you go, that was a lot of healing that took place right there. This was God's providence, not a strange request. This was God knowing exactly what he's doing. Imagine that. So, now, he gets there. Back to 19, verse 9. There he went into a cave and spent the night. So once again, you're not going to overwhelm him. God knows what's best for you. You let him rest again. Then, when we get to verse 9, again, the second half there, he asks what I think is kind of a strange question. Why are you here? Okay, he just sent him there. He's like sovereign. He knows everything. And he's asking him, why are you here? Isn't that kind of a strange question? I kind of thought it was. So, he answers him, and he says, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me. Okay? So, Christian therapist Diane Langberg, she's very good, very deep. She stated that trauma does not heal unless it's spoken. It needs to be spoken and heard in the context of a safe relationship. She goes on to say that the process of healing begins when we can name the trauma and its causes. The act of naming has itself been shown to trigger the first stages of relief. Why did God ask, what are you doing here? Because God wanted him to name his trauma, to trigger those stages of relief. There's always a reason. God is good. So people need to verbalize their trauma. The other thing that happens a lot with people who have gone through trauma is they come up with thinking errors. No one will love me. I'm alone. all these, thinking errors that people have because of their experiences. Elijah had an obvious thinking error. He believed he was alone, that there were no more prophets left in the land. Another thinking error is implied that God is not very powerful if man could defeat him. So Elijah's view of the circumstances was wrong, and his view of God was small and needed to be adjusted. Elijah felt like he was the only prophet left. I can understand him feeling that way. But was that the truth? According to verse 18, if we look down there real quick, it says, "Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, whose mouths have not kissed him." So he wasn't alone, and God was correcting that thinking error. At least he will be here in a next second. So he asks him the question, "What are you doing here?" Elijah answers him. Then we get earth, wind, and fire. Right? God shows up. Says here, verse 11, "Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in an earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave." Isn't it interesting that God announces his coming with the earth, wind, and fire? I mean, you can't miss it. You know God's coming. But then when it came to actually the interaction, it was a gentle whisper. It was kind of saying, you know what? I'm not in the big things. I'm in the little things. I'm always around. I'm behind the scenes. I'm always working. I'm always there. Right? So, this brings me to, when it comes to how do we deal with trauma ourselves, I'll tell you what I did in my life when I went through trauma, and that is my great reset was getting back to what I know about God, his character. I didn't understand what he was doing at the time of my trauma. I didn't get it. But I took a step back and said, I'm going to stick with what I do know. I know God's loving. I know God's faithful. I know God's trustworthy. I know God is sovereign. He's in control of all this. Those are the things I'm going to cling to. Even when life is falling apart, I'm clinging to who God is. Right? The other thing that you need to look at with this gentle whisper was, what was the tone? The tone was a nice, gentle whisper. You ever had these thoughts in your head that kind of punish you at times? You have these loops. You can't do this. You're worthless. All these things kind of run through your head. What's the tone of those? If it's a punishing tone, it's not from God. Or if it's in third person, you can talk to yourself in third person. But you have to look at what the tone is. God is going to convict you, but in a way that restores the relationship, not in a way that demeans you. You have to understand the tones. With those voices that you get, you have to understand where are they coming from. All right. Now, 19, 13, and 14, when Elijah heard it, he said to him, again, he asked the same question, what are you doing here? And he replied with the very same answer. You ever been with someone who's grieving and you hear the same story over and over and over again? Why is that? There's no file in their head for how to process this. They're trying to process this through. And so they need help in processing. So they're just going to repeat it and repeat it. And the best thing you can do is listen. Let them process. Let them process out loud. Best thing you can do. So Elijah, God is allowing him to process it. But this is now after he has had that experience with God. Do you think maybe he's processing it a little differently? Right? Because he now has the window of opportunity when he's remembering the trauma again, so he can remember it differently. He just had this experience with God. Now I think he's probably remembering it differently. So, positively reframing and finding meaning, this is important. Numerous researchers have found that the capacity to positively reframe and extract meaning from adversity is an important component of stress resilience. Resilient individuals often find that trauma has forced them to learn something new or to grow as a person. And I think the classic example of that is Genesis 50, verse 20, when Joseph, confronting his brothers, said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." The other thing you have to realize is Joseph didn't come to this for about 15 years. So it's a process. Okay, back to 1 Kings. In 15 and 16, the Lord said to him, "Go back your way. Go back to the desert of Damascus." Basically, he sends him out to 3 different people and gives him an assignment. He gives him a purpose. I teach a parenting class, and one of the things we teach people to do is when you're parenting your kids and you've just went through and gave them a consequence, one of the best consequences you can give is, "Why don't you help me with the dishes? Help me fold the clothes. Help me clean over here." Doing something together. Because when you're doing something together, it basically shows them, "Hey, we're still okay. Yeah, you got a consequence. You're in trouble. But you know what? We're still okay. We're moving on." That's kind of what God's doing here. "Hey, we're okay. You know, I got an assignment for you. I'm going to keep you busy here." So, and is there any greater joy than to serve our God? I mean, this is a great thing for Elijah to be able to do. So, something else that we need to work on is sometimes we don't, we look at suffering and we kind of take it personally. And if you look at what happened with Job, you remember that he demanded an answer, right? And instead, he didn't get an answer. He got a person. You ever ask these questions? Anybody ever ask these? You know, why do you stand afar off? Why do you pay no attention to me? How long will you continue to ignore me? You know, why have you abandoned me? Why do you reject me? Ever feel that way? Well, so did David. And he never got rebuked for it. This is honest emotion with God. 1 Peter 1:13, when it comes to trauma, you need to prepare your minds for action. In Habakkuk, it says that the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth be silent before him. And you know, to me that's saying all your talking is not going to figure this out. You just need to be silent before God. And if you look at Habakkuk 3:16-19, he says, "I heard and my heart pounded, my lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones, my legs trembled. I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on us, an invading nation. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there's no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there's no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls." Basically what he's saying is, my consequences haven't changed. They're still there. So here's the key right here. Verse 18, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord." It's a choice. A choice that is made. Are you going to rejoice in the Lord, or are you going to be focused on your circumstances? It's again in Lamentations, Proverbs, But the bottom line with all this is you have to remember God is in control, no matter what the trauma is. Thank you.